The flag is flying at half-staff in Kennebunkport, Maine, at what was the summer White House when Barbara Bush was First Lady. Mrs. Bush died Tuesday night in her home in Houston. Quijano is there.
The white bouquet of flowers hung on the front gate signaled the family's loss.
I love her dearly.
So did the first public words of son Jeb Bush. He spoke at an event this morning.
I'm so blessed to be her son. She taught us to serve others. She taught us to be civil. She taught us to love your family with your heart and soul.
In Houston, the place the Bush family called home for more than 60 years, neighbors dropped off flowers and paused to remember her legacy.
The beauty of her is she was so humble.
In Washington, D.C., flags on Capitol Hill and the White House flew at half-staff. President Trump late today.
Her strength and toughness really embodied the spirit of our country.
Today, their eldest son, former President George W. Bush, talked about his last visit with his mother on Saturday. He recalled her famous sense of humor was still there.
The doctor came in and she turned to the doctor and said, "You want to know why George W. is the way he is?" And the doctor looked somewhat surprised. She said, "Because I drank and smoked when I was pregnant with him."
At the Bush Presidential Library in College Station, Texas, visitors offered condolences. Mrs. Bush will be buried here on Saturday next to her daughter Robin, who died at age 3 of leukemia. In a 2013 interview, Mrs. Bush explained why she would be ready when her time came.
I have no fear of death, which is a huge comfort because we're getting darn close. And I don't have a fear of death for my precious George or for myself, because I know that there is a great God.
The private funeral service will be taking place at St. Martin's Church behind me. Among the confirmed guests, First Lady Melania Trump, the Obamas, and the Clintons. After the ceremony, the body of Barbara Bush will be driven about an hour and a half north of here to College Station to be buried alongside her beloved daughter, Robin, who died so many years ago from leukemia. Elaine?
Quijano in Houston, thank you. Joining me now is historian Doug Wead. He was a special assistant to President George H.W. Bush when he was in office. So, Doug, tell us about your typical White House encounter with Barbara Bush. What was that like?
Well, people say she was funny. She was outrageous, wonderful personality. But I'll never forget a breakfast we had in the state dining room. We're sitting there. I was the staffer at her table. I said, "Mrs. Bush, let's let everybody in the table introduce themselves and say what they do." She said, "Excellent idea." So the man to my left, he gave his name and where he's from. He says, "I'm a Methodist pastor." And Barbara Bush blurted out, "George and I can't stand Methodists, can't stand them." And he was momentarily stunned, like, I can't do anything about that now. And of course, she was prepared to give a sarcastic backward compliment to the Methodist people, and she used that device to get her attention, and that was very, very typical of her.
Well, what are some things the average person might not know about the former First Lady?
I think I've been listening to a lot of the comments today, and I think what's I've missed is how bright she was. Stop and think, Elaine. She was reading 3 books a week when they first went into the White House and before. Wow. I'd feed her a book, she'd spit it back with the review, and just a few days later. And then she went through a struggle where she couldn't read and she switched to audio books. There's a whole neurological difference between reading a book and listening to a book. That was hard for her. But a person who's reading 3 books a week, we went to Disney World with George and Barbara Bush on one occasion. We ended up at Epcot Center at the Chinese restaurant so George could eat Chinese food, and we talked about books all night long. So imagine the knowledge she had of art and culture and history that came from reading, and I'm not hearing people talk about that publicly.
Well, that's so wonderful to hear. I didn't know that. I want to play a clip for you from CBSN's interview with USA Today's Washington Bureau Chief Susan Page, talking about Barbara Bush's battle with depression.
Depression occurred when they came back from China and George Bush became director of the CIA, and he was then not able to talk to her much about what he was doing, and they had been such partners in all the jobs that he had held up to then, and she had Depression, we didn't know about it at the time. She told me that she contemplated suicide but didn't have the courage to do that. We can only imagine. It's sort of like a movie, It's a Wonderful Life. How would things have been different if she had followed through on that terrible impulse? But it was something that gave her, she said, a sense of empathy for people who suffer from depression and other mental illnesses, and a realization that you can't always just power through it or talk yourself out of it. There are times when you need to get help, and she said she wished she had gotten help then.
Doug, I wonder what you can tell us about that and explain how that depression shaped the rest of her life.
Yeah, she talked to me about that and said there were nights where she just wanted George just to hold her. You know, their marriage, the odds were against their marriage. They married too young. They were separated too often. They experienced too much grief. Any single one of those will doom most marriages. They had all three, but they reinvented their marriage at each stage in their life, had a great love for each other. And Barbara had a reaction to her mother. Her mother, Pauline, the word that Barbara used to me in many interviews was unnecessarily. She unnecessarily grieved, unnecessarily dwelt on trivial things and was bitter. And Barbara decided to be different and decided to enjoy life. It's in some of her speeches that you're supposed to have fun in life, she says. But their love, Elaine, remember one night we were on a tarmac in Michigan and they were exhausted. He was running for president and they were having to go different ways, and it was late at night. We sat in the limousine and I felt like I should get out of there because they were going to say goodbye for just the night. She was going to get out and go into another jet. He was going to go into another jet, go home. And Barbara said, "You stay right where you are. I'm the one that has to leave." So I sat there for just a few minutes as they tenderly held each other's hands and whispered like teenagers to each other. They were they were distraught because they were going to have to be apart for one night.
Wow, that's
so
incredible.
A lot of people wonder how George H.W. Bush, holding her hand these last few days, how he's going to do without her.
Yeah, a lot of folks have been wondering about that. Doug, before we let you go, I want to play one more clip. This one from Barbara's son, former Florida Governor Jeb Bush, talking about people who would approach him to talk about his mom.
And they come up to you and they go, "I love your mother." And that was always code for, "I'm a Democrat. I can't stand you, your brother, your dad. But I love your mother." It was really a very polite way of, my mom's kind of support was universal for sure. The rest of us were struggling.
What does that say about the broad support that Barbara Bush had?
Yeah, she was politically shrewd. She knew she was they were cutting her a break as First Lady, and she expanded that base. She was very sharp. Sometimes when there were discussions going on, her eyes would lock on mine, and I could tell she'd be sending me a message and communicating to me. She would spot things that some other people on the staff didn't spot. A remarkable lady, Elaine. I'd say she's one of the three greatest First Ladies in American history. People compare her to Abigail Adams, but there's a big difference. While both of them had a husband who was president and a son who was president, Abigail Adams never knew it. She died in 1818, but Barbara Bush lived to see success all around her. Either she's a great woman or she's a very lucky woman, because everyone around her became successful.
Absolutely, an extraordinarily strong woman. All right, historian and former special assistant to President George H.W. Bush, Doug Wead. Doug, thanks so much for spending a few moments with us. Appreciate it.